Hi, I'm Paul McGowan, and I am the CEO of PS Audio. We're a local, worldwide manufacturer of high-end stereo equipment. Been doing that since 1974, I think. And we have been invested in music for as long as I can remember, as far back as the early 70s, the late 60s, when everybody was listening to vinyl, when everyone had a stereo system. I mean, it was back in the day, right? Smoked a lot of pot. We listened to a lot of music. We went to a lot of live concerts. And back in the day, when audio was a thing, a craft, an art that people who were involved in the arts of recording, and musicians, some of the greatest musicians, people call it, geezer rock or whatever, but I mean, those were our guys, Hendrix, Clapton, the Beatles, I mean, all the people we grew up with during that era, and everybody in between. And during those days, when music and stereo systems were the norm, we didn't watch a whole lot of television. There were only 3 channels, ABC, NBC, and CBS. And so we listened to music. We did that a lot. I mean, that was the culture back then, of listening to music. And in those days, music was well recorded. I mean, really well recorded, for the most part. It was at the beginning, when everybody was concerned with, how good can I make this sound? What can I do? Phil Spector got in, how can I make this giant wall of sound? And people were experimenting and having a great time. And then over the years, slowly but surely, high-end audio went back into its roots of being a niche market. Japanese receivers flooded the stores. Cheap crap speakers got onto the market, and I mean, it got commercialized, okay? And that's normal, that's natural, that's just what happens when millions upon millions of people want to get a stereo system. And then it kind of all died out. Television became a big deal. Everybody was watching the boob tube, and over time, music kind of faded into the background, and it really wasn't until and we high-end people, the people with our still interested in great stereos that had the cool setups at home, like me and the thousands of audiophiles around the world, we didn't lose sight of that, but the rest of the world kind of did. And it wasn't until Steve Jobs brought out the iPod, the original iPod, the white iPod with the hard drive built in. I mean, that thing had, was it 40 megabyte? Gosh, I don't remember now. But it had a little tiny hard drive in it, had a screen. It was revolutionary. And all of a sudden, music really sparked back up as a thing. And today, we all, listen to music more, not just in our cars and the few of us on our stereo systems, but the mobile revolution of the phones, like I'm taking this video of, the ability to carry thousands, hundreds of thousands of tracks of music in the palm of your hand, in your pocket, has really revolutionized what music's all about. And along the way, something happened to recordings. Recordings got worse. Now, that happened for a whole bunch of reasons. There was the loudness wars, okay? The loudness wars were started by companies, radio stations, of which I was a disc jockey for many years. And I remember the loudness wars were when FM radio was all the rage in the late 70s, early 80s. During that time, FM radio had just gotten onto the scene and was a big deal. And what happened was in large metropolitan areas, Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, the loudest station won. So as you went up and down the dial, and you're in your car and you're dialing up and down, or even at home as it's going through, the loudest station was the one you kind of stopped on. And if they were playing decent music, bingo, you're in, right? Well, that loudness was achieved with what we call compression, and used compressors. There were all kinds of compressors, of which we can get into later. I'm not going to get into it right now. But trust me that the destruction of dynamic range in service of the loudest sounds on the radio were what happened. And that was the start of it. Then over time, the recording studios did the same thing. Instead of mastering and mixing their tracks for fidelity, to maintain the highest order of dynamic range, to preserve the magic and the beauty of music like we were used to, what they would do is the same thing. Just compress the shit out of it. And when they did that, we lost all the dynamic range. But it did get exciting, and it got loud, and records sold. So that was really how all that kind of came to be. And then home studios came into being. Pro Tools. Sorry, I guess as we're doing this thing in the car, there's always going to be a siren or something going on. This is all new to me too, so forgive me. But the advent of home studios and musicians being able to put an actual recording studio in their basement was a godsend for many, because $1,000 an hour was not uncommon for Electric Ladyland, or for the studio that I trained at in the first place, Giorgio Moroder's Musicland in Munich, Germany. And great music was never made because great musicians, unknown musicians, could not afford to produce their own quality recordings. And so the advent of the home studio came, and all of a sudden, anybody could make a record. Anybody could make a CD. It was a great boon to music. But one of the victims of that was quality, because most home studios, they didn't sound that great. And most musicians aren't recording engineers or mastering engineers. So all of this swarm of change was happening. And then add to that, in this giant soup of change, came basically the ruination of how musicians could make a living. It used to be, if you were any good, you could get out and get a record deal, and you could make some decent money. You could make a living as a musician. But as Spotify, iTunes, and streaming services, which are great for us as listeners, came on board, musicians were getting pennies, nothing that they could live on. And the only ones that could really survive with their music were those fortunate or clever enough to go out and tour, to maybe have big names. So everything's in a jumble. So now, here we are, 2019, it's February, I'm in Boulder, Colorado, and we aim to fix that. We want to change that dynamic, to make recordings that bring the glory of high fidelity back to those recordings, that honor musicians, that allow musicians to make a living, to change the dynamic of how all this works in the music industry. And to do that, we're building a world-class studio with PS Audio, myself, mastering engineer Gus Skinnis, who has very famous, has mastered many of the great, almost all the SACDs, and just, the Stones, the Daft Punk, I mean, on and on and on and on. He's done just a tremendous body of work with his Sonoma mastering system. And I'm not going to keep going on about Gus. I'll tell you more about him later. But anyway, this is the start of it. And the first step for me, and what we're going to talk about, is the essence of what this label is going to be, how all this is going to work. Then we'll get into building the studio and getting a name. What are we going to call this thing? We'll talk more about the name of the studio, which I don't know yet. We'll talk more about it in our next episode. All right. Hey, thanks for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye.